Hello, hello. All right, so this is Maya. You have this nice gray, dark gray grid on this nice gray background. It's very, to be honest, it's very drab sort of appeal. But within here, you can do a lot of very fancy, very nice things. So, a little intro to that is, well, I mean, let's start with this top bar. So this top bar right here has the majority of the tools that you're going to use. Usually, if these tools are available somewhere else in another menu, then they're probably available up here as well. You'll notice that you have this drag down, this little drop down here, and you can swap between different sort of disciplines in the 3D pipeline, and they've geared these options up here to correlate with those. So you see animation has a lot of stuff for this. Rigging has a lot of like, skeletal creation, skinning type stuff. Modeling has basically all of the edit mesh and cutting mesh functions. A lot of deformation in there as well. Getting squash and stretch and wrap deformers, all that good stuff. And of course, effects and rendering. However, this is going to be geared mostly towards modeling, rigging, and animation. And within that, it's probably more modeling based to begin with, just because that's a very good intro to 3D and understanding 3D. So we're gonna keep this on modeling, and this is your viewport right here, not this. This right here, and if I press space within that, you'll see that it goes to a 4-panel view, which is right here as well. And if you go into these different views and press space, you'll see that it kind of snaps that to be the full size of the window. Throughout the pipeline, you're going to be doing a lot of stuff that's restricted to one axis. Now, when I'm talking about one axis, you're going to want to look in your viewport, and you'll see in this bottom left, there's this little manipulator that shows you the orientation of the world. So in 3D, we're dealing with, 3 dimensions. Makes sense, makes sense. Before this, everything you've probably done is 2D. So you had everything on X and Y. You probably, when you're drawing, you probably don't really think about like the coordinates of your paper, of your piece of paper like that. You probably don't think of it like that. If you do, that'd be very surprising. But so you've been thinking pretty much like this. So X and Y, and you have like a portrait that you're drawing on there and all that. And you've been existing on X, which is this red axis right here, which extends this way and this way past this thick line. That's when you get into negative values. So this is all positive X. This is all negative X. This is all positive Y. This is all negative Y. And in 3D, let me just align my manipulator down here to be oriented properly. So this is positive X. This is negative X. And then positive Y, since we don't have a grid extending up, it's harder to see, but it's just a straight line up from that, straight line down. So straight line up is positive Y, straight line down negative Y. And then we got the third and most important feature of 3D, which is the Z-axis. So you got the depth as well. So down here you can see Z positive is this direction, and Z negative is this one. So that is pretty key to understanding the viewport. Now, if you want to change viewport options, say at some point your viewport gets messed up, you're going to want to go into these options. Now, these have a lot of different camera settings. You can kind of look through different cameras that you've set up in the scene. You can set up image planes as well. But to be honest, this menu isn't used quite as much as other ones. This is your different shading settings. So you'll be able to go through smooth. I should show you. Let's see. So I'm just gonna make a square, a cube, and a sphere. Boom, bang. All right. So you have these in your view. The way you go through these different options would be by clicking this. However, you can also just press 1. That means there's no smooth shading at all applied. 2 means it shows smooth shading, or smoothing, interpolated smoothing, not smooth shading. Shows interpolated smoothing in relation to what it originally was. 3 just gets rid of that entirely, and you're only the interpolated view. I'm going to set that back to 1. And then 4, you'll see that it kind of made these meshes a little bit, it's what we call wireframe. And so it's showing the all of the verts and all of the edges. We'll go more into that later, of the object. And you see that they're going around the sphere to create the sort of 3D mesh that you see represented. So that's what 4 does. This is useful when you want to see through something. Say this sphere was back inside the cube, but I wanted to see it. And then I could just turn this on, click on it there, So I'm going to move that back out. And then 5 is our default view or shaded view. So it's going to kind of, if you don't have any, oh yeah, this is going to be regardless of lights because that's a different option, but like it shows a basic lighting setup on the object just so you can kind of preview it in space. If you wanted to see what it looks like with lights, you'd press 7. Of course, I don't have the lights in the scene, so let's create one point light. Ooh, there we go. Nice. Nice. So that's, even this is kind of just faked lighting as well, because when you render it out, it's going to look substantially different. It's going to be way different. So I'm going to go back to 5. 6 mode shows things with texture maps, and we'll get more into that later. And texture maps are what allow you to get colors on the surface of your object and different values for that, like roughness and metalness, all that good stuff. So that'll be in due time. For now, this is just introducing different features of Maya. So going back to this, the show panel has a lot of different options in it, and you can disable different ones in here. So these are all polygons, right? So if I just go into this and find polygons, turn it off, I cannot see them. This is most useful for scenes when you have a lot of clutter and you're like, I don't want to see any of my cameras or effects like my fluids and stuff. If you want to just, yeah, I use it mostly when I'm animating to disable joints, because when you're animating, you don't want to be touching joints at all, and so you leave that off. However, in rigging, that's extremely important. Renderer, you're just going to keep that on viewport 2.0 for the speed of this. Panels is where you can set different cameras. So say this camera that I'm looking through and I'm rotating around right now, say it gets messed up, I can always go into perspective and create a new one. You'll see it created a default one in here. And you'll also see this word orthographic. Now the orthographic is what these views are. So you see these views have no depth on them. So if I were to move this sphere just right over, to be right overlapping that cube, And if I move it super close, well, let's go pop over this view. So now you can see that it's overlapping that square. So it's in front of that cube in space. So that camera has to be shooting from over here, right? Because it's kind of looking like that. No matter how close I move this sphere to that, you'll see that the sphere didn't change size. Let's do that again. So you can see that it's not changing at all. So it has it's a camera that doesn't take perspective into it at all. So it's just a flat view. It's very useful for modeling and getting like precise matchups to your source images. And yeah, so that's what orthographic is for. Pretty sure stereo cameras are for like 3D stuff, like when they shoot like two cameras at once in order to create like 3D movies. It's gonna be that type of setup for there. And so that's pretty much it for the viewport options in there. There's some additional ones right below these. Like this selects your camera, so you'll see over in my channel box, which we'll introduce in a little bit, that I'm on my Perspective 1 camera. We have a bunch of different other you can lock down that camera. You can adjust the camera's attributes right here, and that'll open up the attribute editor, which we'll get more into. You have a bunch of different settings for your film gates and your resolution gates. And your resolution gate is basically what you're going to be rendering out as your final image towards like the end of projects. And you'll have these are like the wireframe options. The only additional one that's pretty nice is this one right here, and that's wireframe on shaded. So now it's drawing that shaded sphere, but it's also drawing the wireframe on top of it. So that's useful, I find, mostly when I'm trying to snap to specific verts when we're modeling. So if I wanted to snap this cube's, if I wanted to snap this cube's edge right here to that vert on the surface, you can just do that, and that's with a bunch of different snapping options that we'll get into later. I'm gonna undo this right there. And so that's pretty much it for most of the useful type of settings in here. There is X-ray joints, but we'll get into that later when we're doing rigging. For now, this is fine. This is just the introduction to the course. Now, I was talking about the channel box earlier. Channel box is right up here. So you can see it's usually in these options. If it's not, you can access it through through this right here, this little button. And the reason it's useful is because you can see all of its actual 3D values on it. So that you have scale, which you adjust on on a per object basis. So this one is a little bit big. So if we bring that back down to 1, you'll see it's in scale of 1. So that one scale in here is 1 grid mark, which equates to 1 meter depending on your settings. It could be 1 centimeter as well. And it could be any variety of things based on how your world scale is set up. But so if I have this, and you're going to be wanting to select different objects, right? So the way you do that is to make sure you're in object mode. So if you mouse over one of these cubes or one of these objects and just right click, you can go into object mode to make sure you're setting the entire object's values. And then if you start dragging those around, you can see these values are correlating to that. So translate, I want you to think of as position. It basically just means position. So if I click on this object, it's at 0, 0, 0 because it's in the middle of the grid on X, Y, and Z. And so if I take only this yellow Y-axis manipulator and I start moving that, look at the translation. So as I go up from that origin point where all of them intersect, you see that the value increases, right? And it's the same for X. So if I move this into the positive side, the positive half of this X-axis, you'll see it gets positive values. So if I move it there, it gets negative values. Same for Z. So there you go. So that's how translation works within the channel box, and that's how you move cubes. Going back into these values, you see that you have rotate. So if I start rotating on X, you'll see that X changes. very similarly to how these planes work. The way you access the rotate and move tools, to be clear, is from the buttons W, E, and R. So if you press E right now, it'll switch the manipulator over to rotate. It won't show anything if you don't have anything selected. So select a cube, and you can access rotate functions. If you press W, it'll put the move manipulator there. So W, or W, and then E to rotate. I don't know why R wasn't rotate. Like, that just kind of makes sense. R for rotate, but you know, we get what we're given here. So if you press R, you'll get your scale manipulator. So you can scale this object up, and scale works the same way as the other channels in here, and you can go in here one by one, start adjusting them to be different. So the yellow manipulator right here is Y. So scale Y is going up. It can go down as well into the negative values. But that's pretty much it. Like these function very similarly, but they're just in different. They're just different functions within here. Like, because you need to move stuff around, you're going to need to rotate stuff around, you're going to need to scale stuff. Another way you can mess with this channel box is by you can like click on each of these different channels. Say I wanted to rotate this back to 0, I could just click on this box, enter 0, and then press enter. You'll see that the rotation has been reset. You can also click on a channel and then hold middle click in the viewport, and it will start changing that channel. And you see that it's just depends on which way I'm dragging. It's going to spin that cube because I was selected on rotate Y, so it's rotating around the Y axis, which is up. Remember, up and down. And same with scale. So I can click like one of these channels and then shift click, and it will select all the channels in between that, and you can middle click drag in there. You can also drag on the box itself, but you'll see that it seems to kind of I prefer dragging in the viewport, but just for precision's sake. But that's you know, basically user preference. So that's the channel box. Now, right underneath the channel box, you won't have to worry about it yet, but there's the display layers. So if you currently there's no display layers in this scene. So if we click this button, that adds an object and it creates a layer. So it's creating a layer, which is this button, but then it's also adding the selected object. So now you can turn that object on and off in there. This is going to be more important later when you have like rigs in a scene and you have a bunch of stuff that you don't look at. You just can put it in a display layer and then visit off. Or if you have reference images in your scene, you can double click that rightmost box and make sure it says R for reference. And now I can no longer click on that. Like, I can no longer select any of that cube. So that's what these display layers are for. It's pretty useful for, like I said, cluttered scenes, things that you want to clean up. You can always double click this and then rename it. So this is cube layer. So that way I know for future me that this is cube layer. It just has the cube in here. And that's pretty much what display layer is for. We're going to go more into modeling toolkit later, but for now we're going to skip that. Attribute editor has basically a lot of the history of edits to your cube, but it also has a lot of settings specific to that object. So you can see here I have all the transform attributes, which means basically these channels in here. Has all those in there, and you can do all the same setting in here, You can like change them in here, but I find the channel box is more easily accessed for your basic changes to it. It also has the shader applied to it, so that you have the basic Lambert shader applied to it, but you can adjust the color of it so you see how it's changing both of them, because both of them share the same shader or material. That is basically how Maya renders out this object. It goes through the material applied to the object, and it looks at the shader of that material and gets all these values from there and then puts it in. So that's pretty much the attribute editor in a nutshell. We'll get more into that throughout the semester. And for the last like, I know there's a lot of things that just have been thrown at you here. The last menu, or I guess just like user interface piece. Now we're gonna do one more after this. That we should look at is the outliner. So if I close this and you don't have it open, you can always go to Windows, Outliner, or you can hold space, Windows, Outliner, because you can access all the same things from these menus as well. So if we open up the outliner, you'll see basically everything that's in the scene. These are all those cameras that we were looking through at the beginning when we were pressing space in this viewport and swapping between them. And this is our cube that we've created. And Maya does like a little weird thing where it nests this inside there. Let's see, display shapes. So if you're seeing that weird thing where it had like the child kind of like that plus sign, if you just go to display and then turn off shapes, it'll be in a more readable format. So if I go in here, you can see you just select different things in your scene. That's why it's important to have proper naming conventions on stuff. So if you have like 1,000 different trees and you're like, oh, okay, I need to know which tree I need to change in here, like it's pretty nice to have a name that makes sense. Since we only have 2 objects, it doesn't really matter that much. But if you wanted to change one of these, so this is a test cube now, you can double click on that name and you'll see it pops up the editor. If you go to your channel box as well, you can always click up here and then rename it here, and it will reflect that change in here. And this is the camera that we created through panels, perspective new. That's what happened there. It made a new perspective camera for us. And then our point light was that light that we were toggling on with 7 and changing around. And that's pretty much it for the outliner. It's just a nice way to preview different like object hierarchies. So for instance, if I this is going to be touched on more later, but if I middle click drag this into this test cube, you see that sphere is now below that test cube. So if I rotate test cube around, the sphere rotates with it. It's just simply parented, or it's a child of that cube, meaning that wherever this cube moves, that sphere is going to maintain that relationship between it. There's a lot of other ways to achieve that as well, but that's it for there. And probably the most, we'll do 2 things pretty briefly. So you have a script editor down here. This is where Maya runs specific scripts that you use in the pipeline. You'll see that it has all of like what we've done so far. It's like, oh, we rotated this test cube this much, and we undid that, and then we moved it over here. We selected the cube, we selected the sphere, we selected the cube, we selected the sphere. So this is where it's like kind of running the actual code that drives Maya. It's through here, and you can, if you're a big brain, you can make your own code in here and execute it in Maya with this. I'm only touching on that because we're going to do that once later in the class, and as kind of a workaround for some other things. But the one that concerns us today is the timeline. So this is probably um, the last piece of the UI that we're going to be dealing with here. So if you drag this around, you'll see that nothing's happening. That's because we have no animation currently in the scene. But if we want to animate this square, I'm going to press S, and then I'm going to drag the timeline a little bit over to like 38. And then you'll see as I scrub between those two values, those two keys, you'll see that like it marked it with a little bit of red there. As I drag between those, it'll show us our animation. And every basically that's just a crash course into the general UI of Maya. We're going to go much more into detail later, so feel free to browse the videos, explore my channel, because we go into a lot of different stuff. All right, thanks for watching.